but it would have been a little bit different in that regionally people would learn the classics and learn to read the written language, often in their regional tongue. But Mandarin would be used across regions, either in an official capacity or even in an unofficial capacity. I'm sure that soldiers and merchants and other travelers across China learned these Tongyu, Mandarin, once Mandarin was the Tongyu, in various capacities throughout history. So we're looking at when the missionaries started to come to China, and that's towards the end of the Ming. And by that period, toward the end of the Ming and into the Qing, a new assortment of words for divergent linguistic registers and dialect varieties arose. Local dialect came to be known as Xiangtan. They didn't use Fengyan in those days, or they called it Tuhua. And the lingua franca ended up in the late Ming with the prestigious label Guanhua, language of the officials. And I think we have to be careful that we note that that's language of the officials and not the official language. There was no officially codified spoken language. There may have been a preferred language of certain officials and even of the ruling class, but it was never officially codified. Although people assume it was, and sometimes they say this rhyme book or one rhyme book or another served as the basis of a koine, but that's virtually impossible, I think, practically speaking. They didn't teach languages in any highly long-term successful, spoken language in any highly long-term successful manner. So we're talking about something that arose naturally among the people. So the word Mandarin that we use in English to translate Guanhua showed up sometime in the late Ming. In addition, later, two varieties of Mandarin, the Guanhua Koine or lingua franca, showed up or appeared clearly in the Qing, and they amicably coexisted, but were clearly differentiated with another set of terminology, Nanyin and Beiyin, which we'll talk about later when we get to the late Qing. Missionary efforts to learn spoken Chinese in the Ming and Qing and their descriptions provide us with a fairly vivid picture, actually, of the language environment of China when we look at it. And I always reread this stuff and get more and more surprised how clear it is in many ways once I understand more about the history. So, how Mandarin in the role of both Yayan and Tongyu actually worked across China's vast territories is shown in these efforts, as well as how the two Mandarin varieties, Nanyin and Beiyin, were reflected in the Chinese that the missionaries learned to speak, or when it showed up, which we'll see was actually quite late. So what I want to focus on in today's talk are missionaries that I think were probably the most influential in early Western efforts to learn Chinese. They learned it, of course, for their own purposes, but in the process, they learned Chinese, they learned spoken Chinese, they had ideas about it, they wrote down what they learned, and they created a record of it. Matteo Ricci, who worked closely with Michel Ruggieri, were among the earliest, not the earliest, but among the earliest, certainly the earliest to provide any written record of missionaries to learn Chinese. And Lazzaro Cantaneo also worked with Matteo Ricci. Later, following very closely upon that, the tradition of Matteo Ricci's learning and description of Chinese, spoken Chinese, was Nicolas Trigal, Jin Ni Ge. And so that forms sort of an early period. And then we can say there's a middle period in the mid-Qing, represented by Francesco Varro, Wan Jiguo. And by his time and his understanding of spoken Chinese, he had earlier scholars' records to read in Latin and other languages, what Matteo Ricci had left behind, what Nicholas Trigal had left behind. And so he was able to create a fairly rich and complete description of the Mandarin that he learned in China. And then finally, Robert Morrison is where I end the talk, because he sort of came at the very beginning of the 19th century and before sort of a whole new change in the way Chinese was learned and perceived came to the fore in the 19th century. So I don't talk about mid-19th century and later developments, except briefly. So, but first, let's just take a quick look at the origin of the English word Mandarin, which is related closely and closely intertwined with the missionaries' study of Chinese. They knew that they had to learn this language that was called Guanhua, officials' language, the language of the officials. Mandarin as a word originates from a Sanskrit word and that was widely used and adopted in Southeast Asia, and especially in the Malay-speaking straits, where it was applied to leaders or tribal chiefs or things like that. The Portuguese were the first to apply it to Chinese officials and to use it to translate the word guan, and this is well documented. So the Portuguese adopted the word, and it may be related to their own word, mandar, to order. But there it became the word Mandarin then referred to the officials. So it was guan. Then we have the language of the officials. And so Guanhua, as a translation into Western languages, it came out as, for example, Varro, his Arte de la Lingua Mandarina. So, Lingua Mandarina, the language of the Mandarins. And then, of course, now in the present day, we just drop the language of. We use Mandarin to refer strictly, generally, to modern spoken standard Chinese. That's not how it started out, but that's sort of like the unofficial translation of Putonghua. But Mandarin occasionally in news still has its connotation of the officials, but rarely. So here is a page from Varro's vocabulary of Guanhua that he wrote, and that has been translated by South Coblin, who provided glosses in English and in characters for everything. And we can find under L, Lingua Mandarina, and he has three translations. He has Guanhua, Zhengzi, and Zhengyin. So obviously, this was, by his day, perceived as Zheng, meaning sort of more orthodox or more proper. I still wouldn't say officially, it's not necessarily official. And Zhengyin would be the correct pronunciation in terms of what officials need to learn to communicate across dialect boundaries. Eventually, the Mandarin language shows up basically as an English term, for example, in the Hobson-Jobson, a very delightful dictionary of South Asian English. And they tell us that Mandarin language is Guanhua. They don't explain its etymology, but they tell us. We'll notice here an early spelling of the word Guanhua, early romanization using a Q for the initial. That's the way Matteo Ricci spelled it, which we'll see in a little bit. But I want to briefly, I guess I need to speed up, so I won't go over this in great detail. I just, here there's some slides that introduce a little bit about the history were the earliest appearances of Guanhua in Chinese. And the earliest one that I've been able to uncover so far is in the mid-15th century in a Korean a book that points out, refers to the language in a way that makes clear that it's a spoken language. In this passage where this person is cited as saying the translation is good, but there are archaicisms in it which are not in line with current practice and moreover are not Guanhua, so no one listening can understand. So there was obvious already a clear distinction between spoken and written. And then there's this fellow that lived in the early 16th century who was a sort of a scholar who actually this person wasn't very successful in the exams, but once he had prepared himself for the exams, the civil service exams, he had decided to refuse to speak Suzhouhua anymore, and he only spoke Guanhua. So there's another example of the word being used and clearly a spoken origin or a meaning of spoken Chinese. There's another passage where it points out how scholars speak to friends in their ordinary dialect if they share that dialect, but other people can't understand them. That's what that means. But once one attains first place in the imperial examination and learns how to speak Guanhua, which certainly they did often before that, one holds one's head high and never goes back to the way it was at home, speaking the local dialect. So here's another passage that says there's variant pronunciations. It points out north and south differ in pronunciation, but it argues in this passage that these are merely regional accents within Guanhua. So there was a sense that there was a common set of dialects that shared enough features that they could all fall under the Guanhua label, but that there were regional accents. And so these were sort of the ideas about Chinese that the missionaries encountered when they arrived. And when they spoke in the beginning, especially the Jesuits, they were interested in being allowed into the country and doing their work there, and the only way they could do that was interacting with the officials. And so when they asked what language they should learn, of course, and in observation, they also learned they had to learn Guanhua. So Nicholas Trigal translated into Latin Matteo Ricci's commentaries and diary, and we see in there, oops, wrong direction, here's an English translation of Nicholas Trigal's Latin version of Matteo Ricci's commentaries or diary, where he talks about the use of Guanhua in China. And he says, there is a spoken language common to the whole empire, known as the Guanhua, an official language for civil and forensic use. He says this tongue probably resulted from the fact that all the magistrates, as we shall explain later on, are strangers in the provinces in which they govern, and also they have to interact with each other. And to avoid the necessity of obliging them to learn the dialects of the provinces, a common speech was introduced. I don't think it was introduced, it just arose. For transacting official government business, and it happened, I think, to be used for all sorts of other things. He says the Guanhua dialect is now in vogue among the cultured classes and is used between strangers and inhabitants of the provinces they may visit. And he says, once you know this common language, there's really no necessity for the members of our society, that's the Jesuits, to learn the dialects of the provinces in which they work. He says, a province dialect would not be used in polite society, although the more cultured classes might use it in their home province as a sign of neighborliness. Well, it's natural. You're not going to use it outside where they don't speak it because you can't get any communication done. So maybe polite society here, I think, more refers to the educated sectors of society. So he says he thinks that this official tongue is so commonly used that even the women and children understand it. That may be the case to a certain degree, that everyone knew a little bit, perhaps by exposure to opera performances and just simply travelers. They wouldn't necessarily speak it well. But everybody might have known a little bit, or a lot of people did. So, looking through major events in Matteo Ricci's study of Chinese, we find that he began his study with Michel Ruggieri in Macau. But Macau wasn't a very good place, they discovered, to learn Mandarin. So very quickly they moved to Zhaoqing in Guangdong. And they had permission to establish a permanent mission there. And Ricci and Ruggieri continued their study of Mandarin, Guanghua. It took them a year or so, and apparently he became fairly comfortably fluent by 1584, a year later, and also had begun to get a good grasp of written Chinese. He had a phenomenal memory, so it was not so difficult for him to learn written Chinese. With Ruggieri, he compiled a Portuguese-Chinese dictionary for which Ruggieri devised a romanization. And that dictionary has been uncovered and was recently published a little over 15 years ago. Ruggieri was soon after that sent back to Rome, where he died, but Ricci moved forward with the romanization that they had developed. Their first iteration of that romanization did not mark tones. Eventually they moved to Shaozhou in Guangdong and became proficient in the written language and began Latin translation of the four books. That's Ricci. And jumping down to, he continued to practice his spoken Chinese and continued to travel. He traveled then to Nanchang in 1595 and was there for 3 years and continued to speak and learn Guanhua, and how obviously traveling across such large distances and across so many different dialect regions, Guanhua would have been the language that he needed to use. Then in late 1598, early 1599, I think in late 1598, he went to Beijing to try and establish a mission there, but he was rejected and he had to travel back to Nanjing. And on the way, there's a little anecdote which I'll share with you in a minute about how Nanjing is the representative of the language, the best representative of the language of Guanhua. Then finally, after 1599, he obtained permission to go back to Beijing, where Ricci lived until his death in 1610. Now, apparently, because he makes no mention of it, and we can assume that this is really the case, Ricci did not need to learn the late Ming period Beijing dialect while he was there. Why? It's an interesting question which I'll hint at the answer to. So the eunuch who had been in charge of this expedition, the first one to Beijing that was rejected, and then moving back south to this Linqing in Shandong, where they made a pause on the way back to Nanjing. And at that point, Lazzaro Cantaneo worked with Ricci to devise tone marks for his romanization. And those tone marks are the earliest case of tone marks used to mark Chinese tones, and they were quite good. And they were adopted basically by all missionaries until the mid-19th century. So on this trip, one of their eunuchs who had been or escorting them had to leave. He is said by Matteo Ricci to have sailed away joyfully, and as a present to the fathers left them a boy whom he had bought at Nanjing. He said he was giving him this boy because he speaks so distinctly, and he could teach one of the fathers who was still learning Chinese the purity of the Nanjingese tongue. So then Matteo Ricci was in Beijing for the next 10 years, and he didn't need to restart or relearn the dialect. And I think the reason is because at that point, it's the late Ming, Beijing was a Nanjing dialect island for all practical purposes. It may have been influenced over the centuries from 1421 when the court moved in until this period, 180 years later, by the surrounding dialects, but it was still led by the Zhu clan, and they had migrated there from the Nanjing area, southern Jiangsu, northern Anhui, and their whole coterie and the supporting staff of their Zhudi's imperial entourage all moved into the city with them, and it was a brand new city that had been rebuilt after tearing down the capital of the Yuan dynasty, Yuan Dadu. So certainly thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jiangnan speakers moved into the city and formed a dialect island, which then was fairly solid and stable as a dialect island until the Qing, when the ruling class changed. As an example of a dialect island that served even much longer and was much more stable for a much longer period, I've worked on the dialect of Hangzhou, which before the city walls were torn down, basically preserved a very Southern Song character all the way into the early 20th century. So dialect islands can be very stable for very long, and I think Beijing was. And so I think that's why Matteo Ricci could go to Beijing and converse quite easily with the descendants of those Nanjing Mandarin speakers. But then after he passed away, Nicholas Trigal comes onto the scene shortly after, and he takes over sort of this enterprise of learning and recording Chinese and working on moving forward with the study of Chinese. The dictionary that Matteo Ricci had compiled was sent back to Rome, and so I don't think Nicholas Trigal necessarily had that, but he had all sorts of other notes, and he also worked on the romanization that Ricci had developed and made some modifications. But he basically adopted it, made modifications in some of the spellings, but he adopted the tones wholesale. So Ricci, Trigal, you can see, arrived in Nanjing in 1611, just one year after Matteo Ricci's passing. He ended up working a long time in Hangzhou. Hangzhou was also a Mandarin-speaking city. There's an earlier form of Mandarin, but it was close enough to be passable as a Guanghua type base language. He edited and translated Matteo Ricci's journal, so was very familiar with his work. And he also worked with Cantoneo, who had worked to develop the tonal marks. So he must have been fairly familiar with the system. And then here's where he lived, Hangzhou. This is looking from the north toward the south. This area is the city wall. So within the city wall of Hangzhou, you have a Southern Song Mandarin dialect island, and that seemed to be very comfortable to the missionaries. The language was close enough to Nanjing. It wasn't the same, but it was close enough that they didn't find it difficult. So Nicholas Trigal is known for his Siru, or Muzi, Guide for the Eyes and Ears of the Western Scholar, printed in 1626. He followed and built upon the work of Matteo Ricci, and basically it's a description, I think, of a Nanjing type pronunciation. He was in Nanjing for a time, and that was what people considered to be the best pronunciation, and this was still in the late Ming. It provides transcriptions of Chinese pronunciation in the Latin alphabet, which is a romanization he adopted from Ruggieri's and Cantaneo's. Ruggieri's romanization and Cantaneo's tone marks are there. And Coblen, South Coblen, has said that this is the Jesuits' final and most mature effort to record Zhengyin, correct pronunciation. I just have circled down here on this slide the word se. You could also see the word sure here and the way he spelled them. Just keep this in mind for later in the talk. Here to illustrate are the 5 tones that had marks. So this is our first linguistic clue for this talk. I'm trying to not be too technical. This is our first linguistic clue to the Nanjing dialect nature of the language. Nanjing also has these 5 tones. And significantly, it has a ru tone, whereas Beijing, the dialect, only has the first 4, and the ru tone has been absorbed and reabsorbed into the other tones in Beijing. But they were learning a dialect with the ru tone. And the ru tone was probably common in the Beijing dialect island at this time as well. Maybe had started to erode or be influenced by the surrounding dialects, but it was still probably of great prestige if you spoke with that. So there it was, and you can see that they mark it with a sort of a circumflex, upside down circumflex. Well, Trigal did this. He adopted the tone marks for the 5 tones, 4 plus 1, and this system of diacritics and the 5 tones of Guanhua continued to be used by missionaries from the late Ming and into the Qing and into the mid-Qing. And even basically by Francisco Varro, so who's our next person to talk about. He was a Spanish Dominican friar who was a missionary in China. He had 2 Chinese names. One was based on the pronunciation of his own Western name, Wanfangjige, basically sort of a transliteration of Francisco Varro. But he also had a Chinese name, Wanjiguo, a Sinicized adaptation. He wrote 2 very important records of the Mandarin that he learned, the Arte de la Lengua Mandarina and the Vocabulario de la Lengua Mandarina. And these both have fortunately been translated in full by W. South Coblen. They're written in Old Spanish, and so Coblen worked together with a scholar of Old Spanish. He describes it as like doing field work. He sat down with the scholar, and together they worked out what it said. Coblen, the scholar, didn't know Chinese at all. Coblen didn't know the Old Spanish, but they had to work together because the vocabulary is completely in romanization in Spanish. And so Coblen also analyzed every word and figured out all of the morphemes and how you would write them in Chinese. So South Coblen's translation gives us a complete version of this dictionary, including the Chinese, as well as English translations of everything. Now, I went the wrong direction. Oh, no, going back. So Varro was born in Spain, and then he was ordained in Mexico, and he departed, he went to Asia from Acapulco. He arrived in Manila in June of 1648, and he studied Mandarin in Manila. So you could also learn Mandarin in Manila. And he arrived in China via the Philippines in 1649. The route to China from the Philippines usually went through Fujian, and that's where he ended up. And there was a lot of commerce between the Philippines and Fujian in those days. And Varro essentially ended up settling in Fujian and near Fuzhou and Funing, and that was his primary base of operations for most of his time in China. He probably traveled somewhat. In the late 1660s, he was briefly imprisoned and exiled to Canton and released in 1672. If we see, just for fun, this old map of China, map of 1734, so a century after he was there, but Funing is on the map. It's a bit north of probably the Quanzhou port where most of the commerce entered and exited Fujian, but that's where he settled. Varro described the different forms of spoken Chinese that he was encountered in his study. He describes this in his dictionary and mostly in his grammar. He says there's a high and elegant language, which refers to the Wenyan. Then he mentions the spoken language, the Mandarin, Guanghua, which he says is understood by the great majority and which is also used with some compounds. Some elegant literary terms are used, which are nonetheless understood by all. He says it is very necessary for us to learn this way of speaking. Being in Fujian, he would have noticed that there was huge variety in the dialects and that the only way you could get around, especially if you had intercourse with educated people, was to speak Guanghua. But he noticed that there was, of course, Xiangtan in the region, and so the native language of their own area, he called it coarse and vulgar, and if you wanted to speak to women and peasants and preach to them, you would need to learn that. And then there was even more coarse language that he mentioned. But basically there was three types: a high, elegant language, the Guanghua Koine, lingua franca, and then the local dialects of various types. And there could be a mixing of the registers. He writes in his grammar that he noticed that there were various romanizations for certain words and that it was necessary to sort of standardize that. And one needs to figure out the correct pronunciation. But you have to find the right person so that people who have the gift of speaking Mandarin well, such as he says those natives of the province, he calls it, of Nanjing, and of other provinces where the Mandarin tongue is spoken. So he says in Fujian, where he is, they speak it with many imperfections and make a lot of mistakes. So one needs to find the leaders, the leading class, and learn from them the speech of Nanjing. But he obviously could learn it down there in the south. He could find people who could speak it and teach it to him. And he learned it well, and he made good effort and actually succeeded quite well at being able to differentiate between different types and what was standard and what wasn't. But he also, just like Matteo Ricci, points out that besides the Mandarin language, which is common to the whole kingdom, there is in every city or town yet another different language, which they call Xiangtan. And that's only understood by the natives of a particular city or town. And if someone's going to work there long term, they might need to learn it. But if you're going to preach there also, you would need to learn it. Because there are those who do not understand Mandarin. But he says you shouldn't try to learn both all at once. You need to speak Mandarin first well. Otherwise, you don't learn either very well. So, note here that he distinguishes between Mandarin and non-Mandarin, but he doesn't distinguish different varieties of Mandarin. It's still not on the map, that they're in his linguistic map, that there are more than one variety of Mandarin. And this is already in the mid-Qing. Right about the same time, writing in Europe, this historian Du Halde, he wrote first in French. This is a translation of what he wrote. He interviewed missionaries returning from China and came up with the same view that they described, that Matteo Ricci described, and that Varro has described here. He says there's a language spoken by common people, and then the Mandarin language. The Mandarin language, he says, is properly that which was formerly spoken at court in the province of the Jiangnan, so they know that it was once clearly connected to the Ming capital when it was in Nanjing, and spread into the other provinces among the polite people, the educated. And then it was widely used. And it was spread, I haven't got this here, but I think part of it, especially in the Ming, Mandarin was spread widely in part because Zhu Yanzhang and then subsequently all of the Ming rulers stationed troops all over Ming China. They probably, the leadership and many of the troops that were stationed and sent to various parts of China originated, especially in early Ming, in the Jiangnan region, northern Anhui, southern Jiangsu, and so they would have formed, and we've documented this. It's been documented. Dialect islands throughout China, southern China, where the Koine became sort of the language of these islands after a fashion, various varieties of it, because they became sort of true Creoles, Koines, that because nobody shared a single native language, they Creolized over time, but they share their common sort of Mandarin roots. So that's part of how it was spread, besides just the missionaries, not the missionaries, the officials spreading it around by their work across the empire. Now moving on, another century and a half or so, to Robert Morrison. This is now the later Qing, and he's the first Protestant, English-speaking Protestant missionary to go to China. And he prepares for his work in China by consulting all the Latin Chinese dictionaries he can get his hands on. Many of those would be using versions of Matteo Ricci's and Trigal's romanization. And he went to do missionary work, but the first task was, of course, to learn the language and to write a grammar in English and a dictionary. And that's basically what he ended up spending most of his time on. He learned, he was trained to go to do his missionary work in an academy that was run by a fellow named David Bogue, who founded this Gosport Academy. He developed a 3-year program to train missionaries. And he used his own sort of lecture notes to train them. They also had linguistic training and things like that. Morrison rushed through the training and completed it in half the time, not 3 years, but just 14 months, less than half. But then he went to London to study Chinese, where he was working hard on studying written Chinese, and he went to the British Museum and transcribed by hand. There were no Xerox machines, so he transcribed by hand a translation of the New Testament of the Bible by Jim Bassett that was held in the British Museum, and eventually he also purchased and transcribed a Chinese Latin dictionary. And he started to learn spoken Chinese, and his tutor was obviously Cantonese speaking, and we have no idea what kind of Mandarin he might have spoken, but Morrison knew or learned from the missionaries that he had to learn Guanghua. Morrison left for China at age 25, so he's starting to learn Chinese at age 25, and he ends up doing it okay. He arrived in Macau on September 4th, and when he arrived, he learned that non-Chinese citizens were not allowed to learn Chinese. So he ended up having to study Chinese secretly while he was in Macau, and then eventually he got to work in Guangzhou, but he worked on learning Chinese and he worked on learning Mandarin. So in his study of Chinese, he didn't begin until his early 20s, but he ended up learning spoken Mandarin and probably spoken Cantonese and certainly a smattering of Southern Min as well, because those languages were really common in that region where he was working. And he also used the Kangxi Zidian as a sort of a reference work in compiling his dictionary. But he just used it as a source for the written language, but his glosses are not simply translations of the Kangxi dictionary. He wrote his own glosses for all the entries. He also had assistants in the effort to translate and to develop the dictionary, and they were native speakers of Cantonese or Mandarin. Here he is with a couple of them in a well-known painting. His principal teachers, he had a Cantonese teacher, a father and son. The father was able to communicate with him because he'd studied Latin in Macau and they could speak in Latin. Then he had a Mandarin teacher who's quite interesting. He knew Latin as well. He'd been trained in Peking, in Beijing, by missionaries there. From a very young age, he was literate in Latin, but he was not literate in Chinese. So he didn't know how to write Chinese. But people criticized Morrison for this. How could he have a tutor who's illiterate in Chinese? But this way, the person was teaching him purely spoken language. That's number one. Number two, what's quite interesting is he was from Shanxi. Shanxi is a Jin dialect speaking region, and the Jin dialects, like the Nanjing dialect, all have a ru tone. So many of them have 5 tones. So after a fashion, maybe his Jin dialect was closer to the Mandarin that Morrison was trying to learn, as we will see. He was trying to learn and record a Nanjing version. He also had another Mandarin teacher after 1809, but we don't really know anything about that person. Morrison consulted the romanizations of the earlier missionaries, but he devised his own romanization based on his own Scottish English pronunciation that he used in his dictionary and grammar. His spellings were also influenced by earlier European sources that he consulted, that being the missionary grammars. South Coblen provides a close analysis of the underlying pronunciation and how his choice of letters is influenced by his Scottish English. And ultimately, he went through iterations of his romanization and he revised it, and he has a mature system in part 2 of his dictionary called the Wu Che Yun Fu. He has this interesting comparison table of his dictionary, of his romanization in his dictionary, which is his romanization is on the right here, and then the missionary romanizations that he had been consulting are on the left, and it's clear that these are in the Ricci Trigal tradition. but he's also consulted other European versions of the romanization as well. But what's interesting is he's the first, of the missionaries that we're looking at, he's the first to really note that there are two types of Mandarin. He says there's a Jiangnan type, which is based on the language of Nanjing, and then there's a more northern type, which he called it Dazi Dehua, the Tartar dialect, which is basically based on Beijing. But he says that currently, especially in the region he's working at, the southern version is more prevalent, so that's what he uses as the basis for his dictionary. But he says it's probable that eventually the Peking dialect will take over. They are very different. And he also makes a brief, somewhat helpful description of ways to alter your pronunciation between the northern Beijing type and the Nanjing type, or at least so that you can maybe make out the difference between the northern speakers and the southern speakers. Well, this is true. At this point in time in China, there definitely were two lingua franca versions, Mandarin-based versions. One was the southern version, Nanjing-based, that we've been looking at so far, and the other was a Beijing-based one, with the change of leadership in the beginning of the Qing and the entry of the Manchus into the city that sort of brought new people into the city, a lot more interaction probably with the Hebei dialects, and a gradual change of the dialect island, but still it has a lot of remnants. It's part of the color of Beijing, are the remnants of the Southern Mandarin that has taken place in the dialect, which I can't really talk about too much today. But what I want to say is that, I'll say it later. So anyways, Morrison, his basic Mandarin was a Southern-based Mandarin. In the mid-19th century, briefly want to mention, once the Taiping Rebellion had occurred and the Westerners, especially Western governments and Western not missionaries, but also consular personnel and I can't remember the English, 外交官员, had started to interact with the Chinese at the court in Beijing. They realized that they really needed to learn good Beijing-type dialect. And so at that point, Westerners began to emphasize learning Beijing. But that's not true with the Chinese. The case on the ground of two coexisting koines, two coexisting Mandarin types, continued. They didn't say, oh, the missionaries are, or the Westerners are now learning different kinds of Mandarin, so let's switch. Southern Mandarin speakers of Guanhua all over China didn't just suddenly switch to Beijing. It's not the way it worked. And it didn't happen officially or even in any great until in the 20s. That's another story that I don't have time to go over today. But in the middle of the 19th century, suddenly the Westerners were no longer interested in Morrison's romanization. It fell out of favor, and James Legge, who had learned Chinese using Morrison's romanization, and in his first translations of the 4 books and all the classics that he translated, had used Morrison's romanization, when he reissued his translations later in the 19th century. Here he is on the left working with his assistants. He ended up switching to Beijing pronunciation, but sometimes in some of the glossaries, both versions exist. So if you ever open up the Chinese classic translations of James Legg's translation of the Chinese classics, and you look at his glossaries and you see different romanizations, you will now know one of them is Southern Mandarin and the other is Northern Mandarin or Beijing based. In some, you need to know the date of the edition. The later in the 19th century that it was published, the less Southern Mandarin you see. On this is a page from the 1861 edition in which he gives both, the Northern and Southern. That's what these two are. So he has a Southern and Northern pronunciation where there is a difference. So here for Jin, for example, he has both Gin and Jin, the Gin being the Southern, the Jin being the Northern. And then he has I can't really see it, yin and yan, ren and yan for ren, and xiang and xiang for this one. So he's got both. Here we can see 1861 edition here of the of a introduction. Still uses Jing, pronounced Ging, for the 4 books, but then by 1893 he switched it to Jing, C-H-I-N-G. So you can keep that in mind. Now Morrison, as I said, he said that this Tartar Chinese dialect is gradually gaining ground, and if the dynasty continues long, it will finally prevail. It actually prevailed through the end of the dynasty and into the Republican period. He couldn't have known that there was a Republican period coming up. But Hemling in 1907 realized, this fellow Hemling, who wrote a dissertation about the Nanjing dialect, realized that Nanjing as a dialect was very weak, and that weakness had been sort of perpetrated by the disasters of the Taiping Rebellion and what happened to the city, and the death and destruction of the natives of the city in the mid-19th century that basically weakened the prestige of the dialect, and it never recovered. I'm sort of running out of time, so I won't go over this. I'll just flip through it real quick. This is a contemporary Chinese view of Northern and Southern pronunciation by a fellow named Gao Jingting, who lived and wrote at the same time as Morrison, but he didn't meet him. He also notes there's 2 types of Guanghua, a Nan Yu and a Bei Yu. He wrote this textbook, and he chose in his glosses to give the Southern pronunciation, but he tells you that you travel around China and you will hear Guanghua everywhere, but you can hear both Northern and Southern vernaculars, especially in the capital. The capital of Beijing, they still speak both Northern and Southern versions of Guanghua. So it's still very popular. So to end here, I'm sort of drawing to an end. Where did these 2 types come from? I just want to briefly tell you what's going on. The Northern type, the Beiyu, is what I call the Xinpai Guanghua. It's a newer type. It's younger and more innovative, and it arose following the collapse of the Northern Song. That is the dialect base that the Northern Mandarin, Koine, was built upon, arose following the collapse of the Northern Song and a lot of the influence in the Northwest, in the Beijing, Yanqing area, and the Jin people there and in the language contact that happened probably created a sort of a new dialect, and then it spread south. But prior to that, that region, as well as everywhere else that spoke Mandarin, spoke a Lao Pai type of Mandarin, and that is the basis for the Nanjing Guanhua. It's older, it has a longer history, and it became prominent in Nanjing after the Yuan, but due to the power and prestige of Zhu Yuanzhang and his armies who spoke it. So there were two types of Mandarin, but how do we distinguish them, and how can we be sure? How do we know that the missionaries are right? There's a lot of debate about this, and it's still seemingly unsettled because some very influential scholars have denied that Guanhua had anything to do with the Nanjing dialect. Here, this one map that I'm sharing with you today is just to sort of show you what happened. Maybe in the early Ming. Here in this region, this is Zhu Yuanzhang's hometown region. He established the capital in Nanjing and set up the empire. And then, 50 years more later, they moved to Beijing, and they into a new city. They established a new capital, and it was a Beijing dialect island. So they brought their dialect up with them. But then it interacted with the local dialects over time, and it became the Beijing dialect of the present day. But it also, this is another story which I have no time at all to tell you today, it also changed to the nature of the dialects throughout the region. Anyways, I want to end with something technical but fun. And that is this chart by Y.R. Zhao. He's simply trying to explain the difference between Nanjing and Beijing pronunciation. And he's explaining a difference that most people attribute to simply sort of southern mispronunciations. But the Nanjing dialect, like the Beijing dialect, has a whole set of words with zhi, chi, shi. But and they match the Beijing words with zhi, chi, shi. But there's a set of the Beijing words with zhi, chi, shi, which in Nanjing had changed because of various linguistic reasons. The dialect had changed in Nanjing to zi, zi, si. But the key is this is a lexical change, probably had phonological motivation, but it affected the lexicon, and so there's certain words that have that different changed pronunciation. So when we look at the missionary records of early Mandarin, we find that the distribution of zhi, chi, shi, and zi, zi, si, and the words that have the changed, zi, zi, si, where Beijing has zhi, chi, shi, belong to the Nanjing pattern. That's one thing. The other thing is that Nanjing has 5 tones. Beijing has 4. Mandarins were all learning 5 tones. So a fun sort of key test is these 2 characters. This chart is to show where Nanjing and Beijing overlap with the zhi, chi, shi, and where there are exceptions, where Beijing has zhi, chi, shi, and Nanjing has zi, zi, si. That's these squares here. So the top one in these cases, Beijing is zhi, chi, shi, but this would be zang, this would be cang, this would be sang. So there's a set of words that fits this. It's lexical. Well, the word color belongs to that. But in Beijing, the word color should be shar. It should be with, it should have a R suffix, but even if we remove the R suffix, it should be shai. And then you add shar, okay? It's not root tone, it's third tone. That's a normal reflex of this syllable in Beijing. But now the standard pronunciation is sa. The standard pronunciation is sa with a sa, not a sha, because it comes from Nanjing Mandarin when it lived in Beijing for all those years during the Ming and early Qing. And so it comes from Nanjing sa. And look at, here's early Richi's romanization, sa and sha. Sha, however, in Nanjing is still sha, it's not sa. So shedao is sha, it has the sha. So all in these cases, as well as Varro's, this lexical distribution of sa and shi that matches Nanjing is clearly apparent in all their romanizations. And a quick test is just whether or not the word tongue and sa are pronounced in retroflex or not, and if they're distinct. In early Richi's romanization as well as the Trigola's romanization, they're distinct, but they're also in the root tone. So that's another feature of Nanjing Mandarin. And so this is just a whole set of words that should belong to the si, the zi set in Nanjing. And here's the Nanjing reflexes. I put hefei here because this particular set of words as a lexical feature of the dialects and the pronunciation is basically essentially shared between Nanjing and Hefei across the region from southern Jiangsu into Anhui. And so Zhu Yuanzhang grew up there. But so this, if Nanjing hadn't spoken it that way before he brought all of his troops into the city, it certainly adopted it since then. But I think it's possible that it may have been a feature of Nanjing even before then. But anyways, this is to show that Varro and Morrison basically match the Nanjing Hefei type. And I've sort of run out of time, so that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Simmons, for your inspiring talk. Now the floor is open for questions and discussion. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself first.
A friendly audience. Nobody's going to attack me for saying that Guanghua is based on Nanjing dialect. I talked about this a long time, several years ago in Nanjing, and they were like terrified that I was speaking on such a controversial topic. But the audience there was friendly as well. They agreed.
Professor, I have first introduce myself that I'm a PhD student from City University of Hong Kong.
Oh.
And my research area is basically the history of Chinese medicine. But I found that, before I listened to your lecture, I know nothing about this topic. But after I listened to it, I found it have lots of connections with the area I'm researching on. Since that in Chinese medicine, there is also a different kind of, based on based on their spoken language or written language, the knowledge and ideas that were transmitted by those forms are different. So since the Song Dynasty, there is kind of the elite medicine, and it's also the popular medicines that were used by most of the population in China, and they were different because the elite, they were studying the Guanhua, so maybe they have their kind of genders, and their medicine is also different with the popular medicine used by the vast majority, the peasants and also the women and children. And also there is also very interesting coincidence in the 20th century that was also transmitted from Nanjing to Beijing, the Chinese medicine that was in contemporary China. The Chinese medicine we're studying now is also the southern version of Chinese medicine. It had nothing to do with the northern version because of Republican China. Their capital is in Nanjing. But so in 1949, those elites was transmitted to Beijing. So it's also very interesting. And my question is that, and I'm very curious that when you're doing research, your research and reading all the materials in the Ming and Qing by the 传教士, is there any text about the medicine? You know, the bell ringing doctors. They were traveling through China, maybe from different province. What kind of language they were using, and I'm really interested about their practice. Has anything connections with connecting with the South and North, and also the elite and the popular medicines? So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I'm sure that there are. This is what's really interesting about spoken language and focusing on spoken language and popular practice, which Chinese medicine is a kind of popular practice. It's more than, it's not simply something that exists in texts. It's a living thing. And so it's going to be definitely associated with local cultures in many ways and influenced by regional cultures and regional trends. To answer your question, I haven't run across descriptions of Chinese medicine that I can recall that missionaries have talked about, but there probably are some, and I'm sure you can find them if you look in some translations. If you can't read the original, there may be translations of some. One place that might be interesting is you can get find a copy of Coblin's translation of Varro's dictionary and grammar, and look for example sentences that talk about, I'm sure he has some, that talk about medicine or medical practice or being sick, as well as just looking for words in his dictionary about medical terminology. I'm sure he has some. I haven't made mental notes of that because I look for other. That's not my focus when I look through the dictionary, but it will be now. If I run across things, I'll make a mental note. But I think that there's an index, an English index that Coblin produced for his translation of the dictionary. So you can find things if you look through the English, find them fairly easily. And maybe his glosses or Varro's glosses and examples will give you some ideas. Yeah.
Okay, this is Guo Bizhi from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So thank you very much for Shi Laoshi for sharing with us your findings in early Mandarin. So your talk focused much on the discrepancy on the southern and northern varieties in the phonological aspect. So I'm wondering, is there any lexical discrepancies between the northern and the southern varieties?
Yes. But that's harder to pin down because often lexicon can be shared more easily. But people who work closely on that, I've done that dialect-wise. For example, looking for northern or southern type forms in Hangzhou, for example, is a very interesting thing to do because Hangzhou has absorbed a lot of Wu vocabulary, but it's also very solid in some of the Mandarin vocabulary that it retains, especially very colloquial but personal type words like the personal pronouns and very common demonstratives and things like that. But in the Gao Jingting book that I mentioned, people have analyzed it and found that most of the vocabulary that he records in there is Southern type Mandarin vocabulary. Very little Northern type, but some of it's Northern. I think that's partly because of he grew up in the southern, in Guangdong, near Guangzhou, but he traveled north a lot. He learned Mandarin when he was 13, living in Beijing, but he still had a Southern perspective on things, and so probably he absorbed Southern vocabulary more easily. But you can find it if you look closely, but I haven't done that kind of work. I work more on the phonology and only look at the lexical things in passing, because I think that that's harder to say for sure, and unless it's connected to a pronunciation. So like the word for color is a very nice one. I mean, the same morpheme is used, but there's Northern and Southern versions. And once you can have the phonological and morphological meanings overlap, then you can make a stronger case. Yeah, thank you for the question. Is the bottom the earliest or the top? Okay, so the questions are here at the end. Okay. So one question is, the Guanhua or lingua franca spoken by officials coming from different provinces or regions of China have differences or variations. Would these differences hinder the efficacy or effectiveness of communication? Yeah, I'm sure they did, but they managed. Just like people, people are less and less used to this now, because Putonghua has managed to, like a iron, you've got a wrinkly shirt with all sorts of dips and grooves and things, and it's quite interesting, but then you take an iron to it and it's all flat and perfect. So that's what Putonghua has done to spoken Guanhua. It's now perfect. So less and less do people have trouble communicating. But, especially in early times, I remember even, sitting in classes early in Taiwan and China with professors who spoke with a heavy accent, and you're going, huh? But you can figure it out. So I'm sure it happened a lot over space and time, and but people worked it out. And the next question was, did written Chinese play an important role when communication in Guanhua failed? I'm sure occasionally they resorted to writing things down. You still do. If you don't quite get it, they would. There's lots of things that need writing down sometimes to work it out, unless everybody's only speaking with one common language. So surely written Chinese would play an important role. But I always keep in mind that written Chinese is still written Chinese. And when you're speaking it, you're then being influenced by the written Chinese. So the most colloquial words in dialects, generally, if you're having trouble communicating with a colloquial local word, you're not necessarily going to solve that by giving writing down how to write it, even if you know. You know, the pronouns in standard Mandarin come from Southern Mandarin, probably, because they're in Hangzhou, ni, wo, ta, and ni men, wo men, ta men, in Hangzhou. So they have a long history, and they have a long history in Baihua Wen. But if you're having trouble communicating, say, with pronouns from a different dialect region, well, writing your pronouns in your dialect may not enlighten the person who's speaking a different dialect, unless you happen to know Baihua Wen, and you can write. If you can't pronounce, you say ne instead of ni, and the person doesn't understand, then you write ni, and then they get it. Okay. But if you write kai, and you write whichever dialect you choose, whichever character you choose to write that, they're not necessarily going to know it's ta. So it works, but you know, it's a living thing. Dialect communication and linguistic communication, and it's living and it's dynamic across time.
So we still have 6 minutes. Enough time for 1 or 2 questions. Oh, there is one more question online.
Oh, just showed up. Okay. Throughout the missionaries' written works, do you find there are any common or general viewpoints regarding the Chinese writing system and its replacement with the Romanization system? Well, I generally don't pay language the most. So when I'm looking at missionary stuff, I'm always looking at what they're talking about with regard to spoken Chinese. And they're not replacing Chinese with a Romanization. I think that is important to keep in mind. The missionaries were not thinking of replacing that. There were some missionaries who maybe thought about that in the 19th century, and missionaries who wrote very good Romanizations, designed very good Romanizations for dialects, especially in the Minnan region, that could then be served as a replacement. But that's a whole nother thing. That's a whole nother effort. In the early period that I was covering, up to and including Morrison, there was no sense that they had to develop a Romanization and then teach the Chinese using the Romanization. That came later, that kind of thinking. So missionaries did not even attempt that in the early periods, I think, as far as I know. At least if they did, they didn't work at it very hard. The effort to give greater attention to dialects and their systems of speaking and using their speech to do missionary work started to develop mostly in the 19th century. So the missionary work with Romanizations was primarily for their own use. They wanted something that they could use to learn how to pronounce Chinese characters. And they realized that writing things out, or pronunciation in a Latin alphabet, worked pretty well. And so that's the general viewpoint that they all shared. Although there was a lot of, in the early period with Ricci and Cantaneo, they had different influences of their own dialects as their choice of letters to use, and also Varro had to make choices, and between his Spanish and what he'd learned earlier from either the Latin romanizations or whatever. And that's what Morrison did too. So they were often adjusting things to match their sense of the Roman alphabet as they spoke it. But it wasn't intended to be a replacement. Thank you for the question, though. Very nice.
Yes. You want to ask a question? So just to clarify, I'm not an expert in dialects, but is it correct to say that the two Mandarin types that you talked about today, that they existed prior to Ming Dynasty, or?
Yes, it's true to say that, because the newer one developed earlier than the Yuan dynasty. It started to develop in the northern Song, but then it began to spread quite widely during the Yuan dynasty. So yes, and so there was a period, because that would have been the dialect of the Dadu region, and this is a whole nother talk, but the Dadu region would have spoken a newer form of Mandarin, and that became sort of a common lingua franca in the north during the Yuan. And that's why people consider that the Beijing dialect must have, at that point, become the standard, and it persisted. But I think that Zhu Yanzhang and his troops had other ideas, and Zhu Di had other ideas. And so when the Ming came to power, that prestige of the Yuan Beijing type, Dadu type dialect fell by the wayside, and the Southern Mandarin gained new prestige again. And so, yeah, they both existed before the Ming.
I think we're done. Yes, we've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This was the last talk in the lecture series on early encounters between Europe and Asia in this current year. So I wish you all happy holidays, and see you in 2024. And thank you, Professor Simmons.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Simmons. Thank you so much. And as Christmas is around the corner, so on behalf of the Academy, I wish you all have a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.